were there any thoughts or reactions to his letters?
Well, he starts with the New Testament, not creation or the Old Testament, and talks a lot about Jesus's earthly life and his human nature, which was fighting, what was that called?
Docetism.
Yeah, yeah. And he one of the first ones to refer to the church as the Catholic Church, meaning universal,
Yes.
the capital C. Yeah,
Yeah, he was.
yeah. And he talked a lot about the reverence to authority, bishops, presbyters, and deacons. I mean, every letter had that. Well, maybe not every letter, but as I read through them at the very
Yeah,
beginning, he talked about that. And he didn't talk about himself as being a bishop. So I went through the letters,
he
those,
did talk. He did. There is one reference to his being a bishop.
which letter? Because each letter had something about, respecting the authority of the church and the bishops, and
Right. Yeah, I
the
got
bishop
that.
was the center of the church, and Jesus was the center of the universal church. But then I had to get back to the book to say, oh, he was a bishop.
I can't find where it is, but he refers to himself as the Bishop of Syria.
Oh, okay.
So
Maybe
Antioch is the was the
right.
leading Christian center in Syria.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So he referred to himself as Bishop of Syria.
How about page 6-8, second paragraph down? Remember in your prayers, the church in Syria, which now has God for a shepherd instead of me.
Right.
Oh,
Jesus Christ alone will oversee it, and your love will also regard of it. As for me, I'm ashamed to be counted one of them, for indeed I am not worthy, for I am very last of them born out at the time.
So Bishop of Syria. 2 weeks ago, we discussed the notion that, well, we had discussed the great apostasy, so that at some point Christianity had gotten completely off the rails. And so one of the, kind of interesting things in the study of the fathers is that there's often an attempt to, in some form, refute a particular father or, minimize them. So last week we spent a good deal of time discussing St. Clement's so-called moralism, and it seems in looking at his letter that it's really not particularly moralistic at all. So St. Clement's letter is short and therefore not worthy of a great deal of attention. But unfortunately, St. Ignatius has 7 letters, so they deserve a good deal more attention. So up until probably about 50 years ago, the general consensus is that, so there are 3 versions of St. Ignatius's letters. One is called the Long Recension. It has 13 letters, but it's clear that 6 of them were written much, much later, from the 5th to, I think, the 7th or 8th centuries. I don't remember the date. So there's really no question about that. And those additional letters were also never mentioned, by anyone in the histories. Then there's a short recension, which is found only in Syriac. Actually, the additional 6 letters are from the 4th century. A short recension has only 3 letters. It's in Syriac only, and they're letters to Polycarp, the Ephesians, and Romans. And then the middle recension has 6 letters, actually 7, but the major source of middle recension has only 6 letters and is missing Romans. And it's commonly recognized as the authentic letters, or at least it was up to about 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, for the umpteenth major time, the notion that this was written by Ignatius came under attack. And so just sort of looking ahead to Polycarp. So the only contemporaneous reference to St. Ignatius comes from St. Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. So in chapter 9, he begins chapter 9, St. Polycarp, by saying, I exhort you all then to obey the word of justice and to practice all endurance as you saw with your own eyes in the blessed Ignatius and Zosimus and Rufus. This you saw also in others from your own group and in Paul himself and the other apostles. And then in chapter 13 of this letter to the Philippians, you wrote to me both yourselves and Ignatius, letter of Ignatius sent to us by himself, and all the others we have here we send you, etc. And so those are the 2 references to Ignatius. And so the argument then has been developed that Ignatius was just an ordinary martyr, that the letters are, I guess you could call them forgeries, although the word actually used is that they're pseudo-epigraphical. Let me say that over again. Pseudo-epigraphical, meaning that they claim authorship by somebody who wasn't the author. So it's argued that Matthew's gospel was not written by Matthew. Mark's probably written by Mark. Luke's probably written by Luke. But so the major case is Matthew, not written by Matthew. Well, for that matter, many argue John not written by John, and Revelation not written by the same John as wrote the Gospel of John. So, is there anything that strikes anyone as peculiar about that argument?
When you said just an ordinary martyr, that was, I thought that was kind of humorous in a way. Is there anything ordinary about being a martyr? But anyway,
well, the martyr was not a bishop, is the important thing about an ordinary martyr.
Say that again?
The martyr was not a bishop.
I don't get it.
Well, so the argument is that Ignatius is just a rank and file Christian.
Oh yeah,
he's not bishop of anything.
Oh, okay, I got it.
And he gets elevated for the purpose of the seven letters.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so,
So going back to your question, whoever wrote, if that was the case, that they were, forgeries, whoever wrote them was giving themselves a step up by claiming they were written by Ignatius, kind of tooting their own horn, so to speak.
well, yes, sort of so, but the problem is that the the author remains unknown. So in some sense, you're not really tooting your own horn because nobody knows who you are.
Oh, okay.
So
Or they
I
were,
mean, you can maybe argue that this work is surviving, into posterity and through a false name, sort of like using a pseudonym, I'll be, you know, known forever or whatever.
got
But
it.
I'm not sure that that's that's very compelling. And if that's why you're using, a pseudonym, then really you're clearly not doing it for your own glorification.
Right. They wanted to lend, if that was a true thing that happened, they were lending, or they were using Ignatius as a way to propel their truth, the truth as they knew it or as they wanted to propose it.
Mm-hmm. But the thing is that, so take the case of Matthew, assuming that Matthew wasn't written by Matthew, which personally I would dispute. I think Matthew's gospel was written by Matthew. I mean, we have to, I think, fall back on patristic testimony, the witness of the fathers, rather than, sort of in modern scholarship is sort of weak and somewhat biased in the area. The legitimacy of Matthew's gospel, if it were to be written by someone other than Matthew, comes from the fact that he's claiming to be Matthew, right? So he's one of the apostles, and that confers authority on the work. The one of the most eventually late in the class, we'll be reading Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. So the work of Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite claimed to be Dionysius the Areopagite in Acts, and that conferred. And so Acts is a book of the Bible. Pseudo Dionysius was converted by Paul. Did I say pseudo Dionysius or
Yeah.
Yes.
Dionysius the Areopagite was? And so
Pseudo in the book here.
what?
It's listed as pseudo.
Yeah, I know because it is pseudo.
Yeah.
It isn't written by Dionysius the Areopagite. That's someone else who we don't know who the actual author is because he signed his work Dionysius the Areopagite.
You like that name, don't you?
Well, actually,
Cool name.
Dionysius is a mystical, speculative theologian, and his his work is somewhere between extremely interesting to very brilliant. But the problem is, in terms of it being contemporary to being written by Dionysius, that it clearly is written much later. And so he's 6th century, and his work is based, his thinking is clearly based on 5th and 6th century thought.
Oh,
So it couldn't possibly be, contemporaneous with Acts. So the point of all of this is that, I mean, let's say that I wanted to create a new gospel, and because I, have some really important theological insights and things about the life of Jesus that I want to, and mostly, I want to put stuff in a new order to sort of present kind of a new theological insights into Jesus' ministry. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use the name of somebody who is well established, right? So, I might use, I mean, there already is a Gospel of Thomas that wasn't written by Thomas, but, so Thomas is a really good choice, the disciple. The Gospel of Andrew, the Gospel of James. I mean, you want to take some known figure, because otherwise this has to be this has to be a marketing attempt as well as a writing attempt, because if well, there's no Saint Ignatius in this case. It's really, if you take Ignatius, who is an ordinary rank and file Christian martyr, you have to build him up to a bishop, and sort of do that kind of marketing campaign. But then if you have to do a marketing campaign, that means you also have to do a certain amount of self-promotion of yourself. And that gives the whole thing away. I mean, why is this person so interested in promoting Ignatius, a bishop who we never heard of?
mm-hmm.
And so this just doesn't make any sense. Um, so, from my perspective, these are authentic letters.
Matthew was from Antioch as well, right?
Went to Antioch.
Yeah, okay.
The gospel was written in Antioch.
Yeah. And Ignatius quotes Mark, for what is a profit of man to gain the whole world but forfeit his life, which is Mark. So was Mark in Antioch at one point too?
No, I don't think so. I think Mark was predominantly in Rome.
Interesting. Yeah. This is the part where he's talking about his journey home, to his martyrdom.
But that's also from Matthew. And it's Matthew that he has clearly the most familiarity with.
Yeah.
Um,
But the author of the book put that it was Mark, which Ignatius wouldn't have done that because the Bible wasn't written by then.
right, the Bible wasn't written, so the Bible circulated. Oh, incidentally, one of the things that I neglected to mention last week is that some early compendia of what would eventually be the corpus of the New Testament included St. Clement's letter. So it was considered in the early church very authoritative. So a second area of attack, besides authenticity, is that Ignatius had a martyrdom complex.
According to who? To whom?
A number of Protestant
Oh,
scholars.
Well, being hauled away in chains all over creation sounds like a pretty valid reason for thinking he might be a martyr.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the contention is exulting in martyrdom
Oh,
or seeking out martyrdom or
oh, right.
being proud of martyrdom.
He did sound pretty thrilled about that in that letter to Smyrna.
Uh-huh.
But he's not alone. Think of all the, like the martyrs who died in the Colliseum. I mean, there are a lot of references to martyrs who, or even beyond that, sought the crown of martyrdom. That
Mm-hmm.
that was a great honor. I'm not sure if it in a prideful way, but in a desirable way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, willing to die for the faith.
Right.
But you don't want to be boasting about it.
Exactly. They wanted it out of love for God.
And they weren't going to deny the faith
Right.
because they lived the faith.
One of the things, and we don't see it critiqued here, I think we see it critique in possibly Saint Cyprian. I can't quite remember. But yes, we do see it in Saint Cyprian. So there are people who seek out martyrdom. And so the implication here, is having a martyrdom complex is that Cyprian seeks out and desires martyrdom. So later we'll see in Saint Cyprian a critique of those who seek out martyrdom, because in Cyprian's experience, they seek out martyrdom, and then when confronted with martyrdom, recant and betray somebody else and decide that they don't really want to be martyrs.
Yeah, it becomes a self-serving.
Right. It becomes self-serving. You become a martyr for your own glory, and then you just discover that maybe it's not too glorious because you're going to die. And so better make someone else a martyr than yourself. So I think in some sense, that is probably a pretty good characterization of the martyrdom complex, that you back out as soon as you become, as it happens. But so what then about the case of Ignatius? How does Ignatius differ from that pattern?
I didn't finish reading all of it on him, but what I was reading, honestly, there were times when I was thinking, gosh, he seems, pretty focused on, proving that he's a martyr. I mean, he wants to be, but then otherwise also his belief and intensity of following Jesus and the word of Christ is so sincere that it did have me come back to thinking he was just intensely he had intense faith, and it did seem that he was honestly just willing to go to the depths, to martyrdom, to be able to stay on his path of, evangelizing or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he seemed like a very loyal follower.
And he still said it was the will of God. that I am worthy of persevering to the end.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's not my wish to please man, but to please God.
Yeah.
So he didn't want people to interfere with that. If it's God's will, it'll happen.
No, he didn't particularly want the Roman Church to intervene on his behalf. So martyrdom is, in dying, one hopes to affect a transformation in the world, not, one hopes one will be united with Christ.
It seems like if someone thinks that their death is going to create change, they have an awfully high opinion of themselves.
Not necessarily. I mean, it depends. Yeah, yes, possibly, but also possibly no. So, did anyone get any sense of where he felt there might be change from the letters? There are really two areas.
You mean, are you talking about geographic areas, or
No, areas,
faith or life?
ways in which his martyrdom, actually his arrest and martyrdom, would have an impact. Two ways.
Well, the way he persisted and wouldn't give up was very noticeable to me.
Right, he persisted.
I mean, that's what the remnant has to do, is persist. It's the only way.
Actually, there's one other thing about martyr complex. Typically, you want to take a lot of other martyrs with you, right? It's misery loves company. But, and actually, in terms of the martyrdom complex that Saint Cyprian, castigated, it's that there's this whole macho thing, I want to die for the faith because I'm, so strong and whatever. And then, of course, you back down and betray others. But, so it's this whole kind of sort of macho culture in some sense.
Well, they would certainly be
Bogus,
judged on their lack of humility.
bogus martyrdom. So instead of that, so you see Ignatius making no other statements about how others should be martyred. That's completely missing.
Well, and he was a bishop for 4 decades, so he was well known. And the Romans knew that. But when it came down to it, where was it? All the pleasures of the world, which would have been his fame, possibly, and all the kingdoms of this earth shall profit me nothing. It's better for me to die in behalf of Jesus than to reign over all the ends of the earth.
Well, it shows he's maintaining his humility there.
Right. In spite of how popular he became, if you want to say it that way. Or...
Well, in a number of places, he notes that with his arrest, and he's thankful for the fact that with his arrest, persecution in Antioch is ended. and the church has, he acknowledges at some point in his journey toward Rome that the church has recovered.
Wow.
So that's one thing, that because he's died, others. So the important thing about martyrdom as a sort of pouring out of self or a self-giving is that as one's death allows others to live in some form. So Christ's death defeats death and brings life. So here, Ignatius's death ends the persecution and allows the church to go on living. But there's a second thing as well. He is, in his letters, there are assorted, kind of really implicit references to fourth Maccabees, the fourth book of Maccabees, in the event that there are two books of Maccabees in our Bible. There are two other books of Maccabees. They were much more widely known in the East rather than in the West. And Fourth Maccabees is a book of martyrdom. It's a book about martyrdom and the wisdom tradition.
So he wrote about that in his letters?
There are implicit references to it. They're
Wow.
not really very explicit, but they're implicit. Related to that, in terms of so we have one thing, the church in Antioch goes on. So his death ends the persecution and prevents others from being killed, as well as from the church as a whole from being destroyed. So that's death as a form of giving. And so, in that sense, if he doesn't embrace his martyrdom and he resists, it's quite likely persecution can continue. So, as bishop, you don't want to do that. Your flock, your church, other worshipers are much more important than you are, because you're their leader. That's the responsibility of a leader. But then the second thing, so that's locally, but also more globally. First of all, he begins his letters, Ignatius Theophorus, to the church and whatever. Theophorus means God bearer. So he's a bearer of God. In the letter to the Romans, chapter 2, he writes, God gave the bishop of Syria the grace of being transferred from the rising to the setting sun. It is good to set, leaving the world for God, and so to rise with him. But the grace of being transferred from the rising to the setting sun. We probably don't quite get the reference from the rising to the setting sun. But Rome rules from the rising to the setting sun.
That's the extent of their empire.
Mm-hmm. Right. But the thing is that Rome is in the West, and so it's an implicit contrast, or you could say it's a clash of geographies. And because it's a clash of geographies, it's a clash of theologies, cosmologies rather, right? So the sun, which is, can be seen as a gift from God that rises in the east
Right.
and carries the God bearer to the west, where the sun sets. And so this is really the path of the sun, as opposed to the bogus path of the sun, which seems to get it backward, rising in the west and going and dominating the east. So the clash then, or the assumption then, is that through martyrdom, worldly powers will ultimately crumble. Rome will ultimately crumble, will ultimately succumb. And so his martyrdom becomes part of that by bearing God from the east to the west.
Well, true. Yeah. Like when you were saying a bishop wouldn't, doesn't become a martyr and leave his flock. But the thing is the main thought is not moving at all away from the faith and to compromise yourself and your faith for, to the Romans, the government, whoever, to be able to try and save your flock. The thing is above that is the importance to stand your ground and preach the faith and stay strong with it. And if you're going to be a martyr and die from it, that will keep your flock that much stronger, so that they can take down the.
Well, I didn't say that as bishop he shouldn't he shouldn't be martyred. I said that as bishop, it's his responsibility to die if that saves his flock.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I thought you were saying that he shouldn't focus on that if he wants to save his flock.
No, he should have focused on it.
Oh, okay.
And he did focus on it. He was grateful that his arrest and the procession to martyrdom ended persecution.
Yeah.
And that's what a good bishop should do. You should be more concerned with the life of those who follow you than you are with yours.
Yeah.
And he carried out his teaching mission in those letters too. That's part of his role as bishop.
Mm-hmm.
Not just guarding the flock, but continued his teaching mission.
Right. Uh-huh.
Building them up and.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And so what he's really talking about in martyrdom, and it's not necessarily an exclusivity or the only way, but he's talking about the responsibility to imitate Christ. In his case, the imitation of Christ calls him to martyrdom.
Well, when reading the old texts, I mean, you know, from monks and followers, the belief to just what's a word for it, to focus and to have your one goal is to follow Christ, in every way, and seek eternity with him, seek the life after death here, and despise this world in comparison. So that, in other words, to have a strong enough faith to just focus more on being there with Christ than trying to stay here. And so, I'm not saying it right, but it removes the fear of dying then, where if you're given that situation to have to make a decision, what's important, of course you're going to say, martyrdom is the only avenue for me, because this is what I seek, is to be with God for eternity, and my life in the flesh is really of no importance to me except to follow Jesus and focus on him and love him above everything else.
Mm-hmm. So authentic letters, no martyrdom complex, no fanaticism. What about heresy? One of the interesting things is that in his letters, he always condemns some heresy. And then he says that, I know this isn't found among you, which somewhat suggests that he's being gentle, but it's found among them. So what are the heresies?
Well, I think one was that Christ wasn't really a man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that there wasn't a resurrection. For sure, the first one. That Christ was not really a man.
Yeah, it's called Docetism.
Yeah.
It's from a Greek word that means appearance. And it basically means that Jesus was divine, but could not debase himself by having a physical body, because the material world is dirty. So we see this, sort of sharp separation of the spiritual and the physical, which is a sort of recurring problem throughout Christianity. So for the Docetists, it means that Jesus just seemed to appear in human form. He wasn't actually human. So he wasn't actually born. He didn't actually die. And he wasn't actually raised from the dead. So there was not really a birth. Crucifixion was, it's kind of like crucifying a ghost. So, fundamentally fruitless undertaking. And of course, obviously, no resurrection and no suffering. Ignatius says in second chapter of Smyrnian letter to the Smyrnians, similarly, one day they will become phantoms without substance themselves, of the belief that Jesus was a phantom. Though Ignatius labeled them atheists and unbelievers and heathens.
Well, and then in his epistle to the Trallians, he basically recites the creed, part of the creed. Well, not the creed. Jesus, like creed, kind of creed-ish.
A
That he
creedal
was from the
statement.
race of David, the child of Mary, who was truly born, ate and drank. So he was truly born, ate and drank, was truly persecuted under Pontius Pilate, was truly crucified and died before the eyes of those in heaven and those on earth and those under the earth, who was also truly raised from the dead, since his Father raised him up, who is in like manner will also raise us up who believe in him.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically the creed.
Yeah. Yeah, very.
Including the fact that he was truly human.
Mm-hmm. It focuses on Jesus as human less than Jesus as divine. But yeah, it's definitely a creedal statement. But it's intended to focus on Jesus as human. So do we see anything similar to Docetism? Do we see anything similar to a radical separation of material and spiritual in our own day?
In our own day now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting.
Isn't that part of the problem we're having with the faith or the growing of the church throughout society?
How so?
People, I'm not talking just about the Catholic Church, but all the faiths, except maybe Islam. I think that's pretty strong. And the church, Christian church in Africa is really strong, but materialism seems to predominate a lot in modern society.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll live for the moment. Kind of, that's nothing new, but we've gotten away from a lot of core family values to respect of individuals and others in society and the greater good and working together for the common good.
Yeah. And basically the whole definition of what love is in today's society has been turned around to suit the society's wants and needs, and to move away from what Christ expects and demands from us. It's to not for people not to be able to have the freedom to do as they choose. And of course, that's why they have the ability to choose. But they don't, they're unable to see that they're going down the wrong path. But, they're a lot of the faiths, the new, modern day religions and faiths that are popping up are all basically just professing to be based around Jesus and to love, yet it's totally empty. It has no soul to it, no meat, because they aren't following Jesus at all. They're just doing what they want using his name.
There's no sacrifice, personal sacrifice involved.
Right. Yeah.
It's not about just us personally, individually, our preferences and wants and desires to stay the same and not have to give something up or be inconvenienced or whatnot. But
yeah.
So that can be translated into society too, that's kind of how we're living these days. We're not willing to go out of our way for other people so much.
Right. Yeah.
As much.
Terribly so.
We have material world on one hand, and we have the spiritual world, spirituality, the divine on the other hand. So fundamental to Christianity is incarnational, so that God entered history in a powerful way, in some sense uniting humanity with the divine. And to start with, God created all things good in the first place. So the material world is not to be despised. The use of the material world has become disordered, but the material world itself is not bad. So Pope Benedict talks about about the damage done by a one-sided emphasis on the theology of salvation at the expense of minimizing the theology of creation. So when we view heaven as the goal, then we're tending to separate the physical and the spiritual in a way that can be very harmful. So, and especially when we do that, we begin to think that we can do things to earn heaven. As in, am I good enough to go to heaven? Have I done enough to go to heaven? But that transforms heaven into a meritocracy, which it most assuredly is not. And it also forgets that the ultimate goal is not heaven as in some ethereal, disembodied state, but the ultimate goal is a new heaven and a new earth in which we have resurrected bodies which are very material. And so, we have a reunification of the spiritual in the end, the spiritual and material, in a way that both are compatible and self-sustaining. So there's a way that that separation of material. We're not called to care for the poor or the oppressed, to fight oppression, so that we go to heaven. We're called to do it to ease human suffering and out of compassion for our fellow brothers and sisters.
Right. And
yeah. So in, we see, and it's more true, I think, in, evangelical Christianity, we see that sharp separation of the spiritual and material. So in the prosperity gospel, we have it skewed in one direction. God is going to bless me now. He is going to pour out wealth and abundance on me. or he's going to do other stuff that I want. If I'm
Right.
sick, heal me. That's my privilege or whatever. Jesus paid for it at the cross, and so I'm entitled.
Yeah.
So that really focuses almost entirely on the material.
Well,
Then
that,
on the other,
yeah.
then
Yeah.
on the other hand, there's am I saved? I've let Jesus into my heart. I'm going to heaven, and that's a really sharp separation of the material and the spiritual.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm simply going there. Doesn't matter. That's guaranteed.
Yeah. Well, when people think that, then they aren't, they aren't making the right choice. They really are not following Christ. They're thinking of their own gain. And, so that's not a sincere, follower, really. Because if you're really, really following Jesus, you're not thinking about your own gain. God sees everything
Right.
and
You're
knows,
not
but
thinking about
you're doing it for the love of God to do it.
right. And
And that's what people have lost.
called to pick up our crosses rather.
Yeah, I mean, you're just doing it, for the love of God. But that's what has been lost, I think. People are too but we've literally lost the fear of God around society. The whole idea of knowing God is there and is turned very materialistic and self-serving, and using God's name for people's own benefit to get ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, a lot of that is, so when the church begins to focus on heaven to the exclusion of all else, there are two things. Both of those, in some sense, are destructive. So, first of all, when we focus on the other side of it, as in the prosperity gospel, that God wants to bless us and make us rich, that's a decidedly first world theology. It's inapplicable to a majority of the world's population. And even within the first world, it's inapplicable to the poor. So it is above all a racist theology. It's a theology for white people to, feel good about themselves and their relationship to the God they worship who doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
On
Yeah,
the other
everything's
side of it,
askew.
on
Yeah.
the other side of it, I'm going to heaven. For those who are suffering and those who are struggling, for those who are victims of oppression, suggests that you need to like it and put it all off, put off doing anything about it, and you'll go to heaven, which is not a very satisfying answer. And so, you know, both of those theologies turn non-believers away. They provide no insight into who God is. They provide no revelation of God. If you wander around the streets asking people, "Are you saved?" I mean,
Yeah, it is. It's
as a Christian, people came up to me, "Are you saved?" Well,
Yeah.
Why don't
No, you're right. It's just crazy. But the thing is people don't realize that, like you do hear so many of the faiths around literally telling people how, be good, and you will have abundance, poured down onto you. But everything's equated to money. And the thing is if we simply loved each other and tried to focus on helping others as we would ourselves, and everybody would find that they had so much love in them and caring for each other. That is the prize. That is when you reach the love that God wants us to have. And that's the abundance that you get. That's not material, and that's what the people in this world, they don't grasp. That's not what they're getting. That's not the message they're getting through what's being preached to them. They're thinking they're going to get all these riches and benefits and have a very happy life but that's not it. It's once they actually do stuff authentically and feel the love that Jesus had, that's when the light bulb turns on, and they feel that. But people aren't getting that because they aren't even, the kids today, they aren't even aware of God so much of the time.
Although, we have to separate in a lot of ways the secular world from, the world of faith. I mean, in many ways, Christianity has paved the way for the mess we're in through its materialism and through its misplaced spiritualism. So
literally.
So I mean, it's very difficult for non-believers to look at Christians and see something they want to emulate, especially if they're seeking for answers or are questioning what is the value of this world. Is there a God? And you look at Christians and although it's very likely that there are more sterling examples of Christians than not, the ones getting the most attention and the loudest are those who are, the more whacked you are, the greater the attention. And we saw that, during COVID, where I mean, the crazies were out in abundance, and today we see calls to violence. We see all sorts of Christians living in an alternate reality and in fantasy land. We see, QAnon is largely a Christian phenomenon. Just insanity among many Christians. But we're fortunate now, 15 minutes past time, and
now we know what we're going to pray for.
Yeah, exactly.
We didn't quite finish Ignatius. It would be good to talk about the structure of the church, and also good to talk a little bit. The second heresy was the Judaizers.
What was the second one?
The Judaizers.
And those are
they're Christians who really want to return to the Mosaic law in some form.
Oh. Yeah.
And so that's a very common heresy that's persisted throughout Christianity. We see it today. Let's plan on finishing the discussion of St. Ignatius. and then doing St. Polycarp